Did you know that one mistake could cost millions of lives? In this story, the USA decided the fate of the war in just a few days. If you're interested in the truth about World War II, subscribe and hit the like button. There are many shocking facts ahead. December 16, 1944, 0531. Monschau, the German-Belgian border. Imagine the biting cold of pre-dawn darkness, the kind that sinks into your bones and makes each breath feel like shattered glass. Now picture yourself in the boots of Colonel Oscar Alfred Axelson, commander of the U.S. 406th Artillery Group. Before him, cloaked in secrecy, stood rows of ammunition crates bearing the cryptic markings that only a select few in the Allied command even knew existed. And in that moment, Axelson faced a choice, one that defied direct orders from the highest echelons of command. What would you have done standing there? Through his field glasses, Axelson watched as German troops began to mass a shadow swelling on the edge of history. It was the beginning of Hitler's final gamble in the West, Operation Watch on the Rhine. The 38th Cavalry Squadron, stationed on the vulnerable northern flank of what would soon be remembered as the Battle of the Bulge, was teetering on the brink of annihilation. "Sir, German artillery preparation has commenced," his operations officer announced, tension thick in the air. "The 38th is requesting immediate fire support." Axelson turned his eyes back to the crates. Inside were rounds labeled T-98 posit weapons, so secret, so advanced, they had been banned for use over land. These were the proximity-fused shells, a technology cloaked under the codename VT for variable time to throw off enemy intelligence. Inside each shell, a miracle of miniaturized engineering lay dormant. A radio-triggered fuse designed to detonate precisely 30 feet above the ground, raining down lethal steel fragments in a cone of destruction. Foxholes? Useless. "Load the VT shells," Axelson ordered quietly but firmly, and with those words, the rules of war changed. By 06:18, exactly 47 minutes later, German troops would meet a weapon they never knew existed. The skies above them would burst with fury as American artillery delivered the first combat use of a technology so advanced, German scientists had dismissed it as a fantasy. In that dawn, fire didn't fall from the heavens, it exploded above them. Each shell was a mechanical genius. When triggered, it erupted at 30 feet above the battlefield, sending a blizzard of supersonic steel fragments tearing through the air at 3,000 feet per second, saturating a 60-yard radius with deadly precision. No trench was deep enough, no cover thick enough, no defense sufficient. This was not just artillery. This was industrial dominance turned into firepower. The proximity fuse would go on to be classified by the U.S. military as the third most important technological achievement of the war, just behind radar and the atomic bomb. But unlike those, this one arrived in complete silence until it was too late to react. Imagine the brilliance. A fully functional miniature radio station, 4 vacuum tubes, dozens of components, small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, tough enough to survive a force 20,000 times greater than gravity. The shell detected its altitude and detonated at the moment of greatest lethality. The engineering was so precise, each fuse contained over 130 components, manufactured to tolerances finer than a human hair one 10,000th of an inch. The scale of this project was colossal. Initiated in 1940, it consumed the equivalent of 15 billion in today's dollars. By the end of 1943, American factories were churning out 40,000 fuses per day, with that number soaring to $70,000 by war's end. Between 1942 and 1945, the U.S. produced 73,181 proximity fuses. Of these, more than 6 million were shipped into combat, the rest used for testing a future that was rapidly arriving. Assembly took place in sterile clean rooms by 110,000 workers, many unaware of what they were building. And the power source. Ingenious. Each shell carried a tiny wind-powered generator, activated only after firing. A small propeller would deploy into the slipstream, generating electricity that brought the internal circuitry to life just seconds before impact. Until then, the device was inert-safe, undetectable, unjammable, and then came the dawn of reckoning at 06:18 on December 16th as the German offensive thundered to life. Axelson's 406th Artillery opened fire, without clearance, but with conviction. It was a calculated defiance born of necessity. Eisenhower wouldn't even formally request authorization until December 19th. The full clearance wouldn't arrive until December 24th. But by then, the battlefield had already spoken. The results were catastrophic for the Germans. Soldiers, trained by rote to dive into their foxholes at the first sound of incoming artillery, did just that. But this time, their shelters offered no safety. The shells didn't hit the earth, they exploded above it. Shrapnel descended vertically, bypassing traditional defenses entirely. It was slaughter from the sky. After-action reports from the 99th Infantry Division tell the story with chilling clarity. VT fused concentrations on German assembly areas near Krinkelt resulted in extraordinary casualties among lead battalions within 12 minutes of fire mission commencement. Enemy medical services were overwhelmed. Imagine being there under that sky. What would you think? Crouched in your foxhole as death reigned vertically, immune to your years of training? This was not merely a new weapon. This was a message, a thunderous declaration that the age of American technological supremacy had fully arrived. And in the fog of that frigid December morning, it became unmistakably clear. The mathematics of death had been rewritten. Imagine a battlefield where the air itself becomes the enemy, where each step forward means stepping over the still warm bodies of fallen comrades. That was the reality for German assault troops pushing through the Ardennes in December 1944. Around Malmedy, where American artillery units unleashed their fury upon advancing SS formations, the cost was staggering. By December 23rd, Allied intelligence estimated that 2,000 German soldiers had been killed by proximity-fused shells alone. The psychological toll may have even surpassed the physical devastation. Witnesses reported that some German soldiers, stripped of hope and coordination, charged toward the very artillery fire they had once feared, shouting, "Kamerad!" in surrender. What kind of weapon could so unnerve hardened troops of the Waffen-SS? To grasp its impact, we must delve into the brutal physics behind airburst artillery, a revolution in the geometry of death. Let's step into the shoes of a soldier crouched in a foxhole. Traditionally, this shallow sanctuary offered a solid 90% chance of survival against a standard high-explosive shell. When such a shell hit the ground, half of its fragments were swallowed by the earth, 45% shot out sideways, and a mere 5% climbed skyward. But what if the explosion didn't come from the ground? Proximity-fused shells changed everything. These rounds detonated 30 feet above the surface, releasing 100% of their fragmentation downward or outward in a deadly inverted cone. The result? A lethal radius that ballooned from 25 yards to 60 yards. Worse still, the fragments descended at angles between 30 and 45 degrees, perfect trajectories, to bypass overhead cover and plunge directly into foxholes, trenches, and rifle pits. The area of lethality expanded from 60 to 3,000 square feet, a 50-fold increase. This wasn't just an evolution in artillery. It was a complete redefinition of how infantry could be targeted. Traditional field fortifications, built on principles honed over centuries, had suddenly become obsolete in a single sunrise. A triumph of microscopic engineering. Each proximity fuse was more than a weapon. It was a technological miracle. To function, it had to survive a launch force of 20,000 Gs, operate in temperatures from 50 degrees Celsius to 120 degrees Celsius, spin up to 30,000 revolutions per minute, and sit in ammunition dumps from the jungles of the Pacific to the frozen bunkers of Europe, all while remaining perfectly reliable. And at its heart were 4 hardened vacuum tubes, a triode for both detection and oscillation, a pentode to amplify the signal, a therotron to act as a trigger switch, and sometimes a diode for rectification. These weren't your grandmother's radio tubes. They were miniature marvels of durability and precision, completely unlike any commercial electronics of their time. Science and industry in lockstep. It all began in August 1940, when the British Tizard mission crossed the Atlantic, bringing with it some of Britain's most precious scientific secrets, including radar and the theoretical groundwork for a proximity fuse. While British physicists had proven the concept, they lacked the manufacturing muscle to bring it to life. Enter the National Defense Research Committee, established in June 1940. Proximity fuse development was declared second only to radar in priority. The Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory became the nerve center of innovation, while American factories began the titanic task of scaling up. Challenges were monumental. The solution, a new field of engineering, micro-scale ordnance. At its peak, Section T, the code name for the Proximity Fuse Project, employed over 3,000 scientists and engineers. They created new plastics, revolutionary vacuum tubes, and assembly techniques that achieved tolerances measurable in 10,000ths of an inch. The breakthrough came on January 29, 1942, when a proximity fused shell obliterated a drone plane over Chesapeake Bay. By August 1942, the USS Cleveland was equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft ammunition, and the results were immediate. Perfection at sea, hesitation on land. In the Pacific theater, proximity fuses quickly became the decisive edge. The USS Helena made history on January 5, 1943, by downing a Japanese dive bomber with just 4 shells, a feat unimaginable with conventional ammunition. But concerns remained. The technology was so sensitive, so secret, that the U.S. military refused to deploy it over land, where the enemy might recover unexploded examples and unlock its secrets. This moratorium held until the Axis threw its final blow in the Ardennes, and officers like Colonel Axelson made bold, unauthorized choices that changed the course of the war. At sea, there were no such limits. Ships using proximity fuses boasted incredible efficiency, averaging 310 rounds per enemy aircraft destroyed, compared to 1,162 rounds with conventional fuses. By 1944, only a quarter of American anti-aircraft rounds were proximity fused, but they accounted for over half of enemy kills. The data didn't lie. During the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the fuses helped inflict catastrophic losses on the Japanese air fleet. The result was the infamous Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, where over 400 Japanese planes were annihilated in a single engagement. the British joined the airburst revolution. The fuse's land-based debut in Europe came not from Americans, but from the British, who began using proximity rounds on June 12, 1944, just days after D-Day, to defend against the terror of V-1 flying bombs. The results were immediate and astonishing. Within 4 weeks, British anti-aircraft batteries boosted their success rate from 17% to 7 to 9%. General Sir Frederick Pyle, head of Anti-Aircraft Command, summed up what many were beginning to realize: the most remarkable scientific achievement in the history of warfare. He wasn't exaggerating. With every shell that detonated above its target, the proximity fuse reshaped modern combat. It blurred the boundary between science and destruction, between innovation and annihilation. And for those caught beneath its steel rain, it didn't just end lives, it erased the very concept of safety. How do you fight an enemy who strikes from the air without warning, without mercy, and with terrifying precision? By the end of December 1944, that was the question echoing through every German command post along the Western Front, and it had no good answer. The breaking point, bureaucracy, meets battlefield. Until the Battle of the Bulge, the American proximity fuse had remained largely confined to the sea and sky-restricted from ground use for fear that the enemy might recover unexploded shells and unravel its secrets. But as the Wehrmacht surged forward through the Ardennes and American infantrymen bled in the snow, that restriction became unsustainable. Field commanders were increasingly vocal. They knew the technology existed. They knew it could save lives. Watching their men die while game-changing munitions sat in crates was intolerable. The dam broke in December, and with it came one of the most consequential shifts in firepower of the entire war. The warning Germany ignored. Ironically, the Germans had seen the signs. In October 1944, General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring noticed something peculiar: dramatic increases in Luftwaffe losses to Allied anti-aircraft fire. Recovered metal fragments bore the telltale signs of airburst detonations, unusual scoring patterns, unnatural fragment dispersion. Kesselring sounded the alarm in a report to the OKW, Oberkommando der Wehrmacht. Evidence suggests Americans possess altitude-triggered ammunition. If adapted to ground artillery, effects on infantry would be catastrophic. Recommend immediate investigation of countermeasures. Berlin's response? Flat denial. Technical evaluation concludes proximity detonation under battlefield conditions impossible. American anti-aircraft improvements attributed to radar direction and increased gun density. No action required. That blind spot would cost them dearly. The irony was crushing. Germany had once led the race to develop proximity fuses, experimenting with 30 to 50 different prototypes: acoustic, electrostatic, and radio-based. But in 1940, Hitler issued a decree terminating any research that couldn't yield results within 6 months. Their program died before it could be born. And then came the cruelest twist of all. During the Battle of the Bulge, German troops captured roughly 20,000 American proximity fuses and had no idea what they were. Their scientists had long assumed such devices were impossible due to the immense launch acceleration. They held the crown jewel of Allied artillery in their hands and never recognized it. American industry, precision on a grand scale. While German scientists dismissed the impossible, American factories were producing miracles by the tens of millions. 5 major companies carried the weight of proximity fuses final assembly. RCA, 2 plants, 9 million units. Sylvania, 5. 7 million, Crossley Corporation, 5. 2 million, McQuay. Norris, 2. 9 million, Eastman. Kodak, 2. 4 million. The Sylvania plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, stood as the crown jewel. 26% of all proximity fuses originated there. Crossley's Cincinnati facility, staffed by 8,000 workers, produced up to 6,500 units per day and consumed more electricity than entire German cities. Environmental controls kept temperatures within 2 degrees to prevent even microscopic thermal expansion. Quality control was relentless. Defects down to 1/50,000th of an inch were identified and rejected. Nearly 28% of all finished fuses failed to meet standards and were discarded, a rejection rate unthinkable in German production, yet acceptable in American strategy, because output was simply overwhelming. At Sylvania, the heart of the operation was female. 90% of the 10,000-person workforce in Ipswich were women, many recruited locally. In clean rooms with filtered air, they assembled components under microscopes, checking tolerances of 2,000ths of an inch. Each woman performed a precise task, repeated thousands of times per shift, a human symphony of exactness. Over 100 companies fed this machine. More than 2,000 suppliers, from powder mixes to micro-machining shops, formed a supply chain unlike any in wartime history. The funny fuse changes the war. By Christmas Day, 1944, the gloves were off. Proximity fuses were in full use across the Ardennes. The U.S. Army would go on to fire 200,000 rounds during the Battle of the Bulge alone. Even General George S. Patton, once skeptical of the new technology, became a fierce believer. On December 25, 26, his Third Army used proximity-fused artillery near Ardennes, killing approximately 700 German soldiers, a number verified by battlefield count. Patton's blunt verdict? The funny fuse won the Battle of the Bulge for us. From a commander who championed tanks and mobility over artillery, this was nothing short of an epiphany. Fear from the sky, psychological shockwaves. What did German troops feel in the face of this new terror? Interrogations revealed the answer: helplessness. The shells didn't behave like any artillery they had ever known. Foxholes, once sanctuaries, became traps. One captured officer lamented, "Your shells explode exactly at treetop height, always the same height. We tried everything, deeper holes, concrete covers, dispersal, nothing worked." That unwavering 30-foot detonation height, achieved through radio precision, was more terrifying than randomness. It was consistent, inevitable, inescapable. The Hürtgen Forest, a lab of lethality. In the Hürtgen Forest, where dense canopy had long shielded German troops, the authorization of proximity fuses on December 18th transformed the battlefield. Tree bursts were always feared but difficult to execute with traditional time fuses. Now, they happened automatically. The 4th Infantry Division fired 12,000 proximity-fused rounds in the first 48 hours. Their after-action report described not just increased casualties, but a breakdown in enemy morale. German soldiers abandoned foxholes and fled to buildings where conventional artillery cut them down. Medics reported new wound patterns, deep shoulder and cranial punctures. Artillery had become a descending scalpel. No place left to hide. Operation Grenade. When Operation Grenade launched on February 23, 1945, aiming for the Rhine, the 9th Army unleashed hundreds of thousands of proximity-fused shells in its opening week. German fortifications, months in the making, crumbled under airburst fire. Desperation set in. A February 10th directive ordered all foxholes be dug too. 5 meters deep, with 30-centimeter log covers topped with half a meter of earth. By February 18th, the Wehrmacht revised again. Only covered trenches, overhead concrete, steel shielding as if depth and timber could stop steel rain. But the damage had been done. The Wehrmacht's last hope and edge in defensive ground warfare had been vaporized above their heads. In the end, the proximity fuse was more than a technological marvel. It was a quiet executioner, descending from the clouds with mathematical certainty. It erased the lines between science and combat, between shelter and death. And as the war thundered toward its end, it left no doubt. The age of industrial warfare would be won by those who mastered precision from afar. What if your enemy could kill you with such precision that no shelter was safe, no trench deep enough, and no armor thick enough? By spring of 1945, German soldiers no longer feared just the enemy in front of them, they feared the skies above. A last attempt to adapt. As American proximity-fused shells rained over the Ardennes, German military planners grew desperate. On February 26, a directive abandoned dreams of reinforced shelters and simply instructed, units will disperse to maximum distance combat effectiveness permits, no more than 2 men in any position. Why such a drastic change? Because the previous directives digging 2 5-meter-deep foxholes with half-meter overhead protection were physically impossible. The materials, manpower, and time simply didn't exist. The battlefield had moved faster than engineering could follow. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, captured on March 7, 1945, illustrated both the tactical brilliance and operational limits of proximity fuses. When Luftwaffe Karl Timmermann requested VAT-fused artillery to slow retreating German forces across the bridge, the request was denied. Friendly troops were too close. The incident, recorded in official U.S. Army histories, served as a reminder. This weapon, like all powerful tools, demanded discipline in its use. Germany's technological dilemma: the Germans had not been blind to the power of the proximity fuse. In 1944, Rheinmetall resumed research and successfully test-fired several hundred working prototypes. The theory was sound. The physics understood. But as always, the bottleneck wasn't brains, it was production. To match American output, German engineers calculated they would need to build 15 new electronics factories, train 50,000 specialized workers, create entire manufacturing processes from scratch, source 500 tons of refined copper and 50 tons of silver monthly, produce 2 million miniature vacuum tubes, employ 100,000 skilled workers. Even if Germany had the materials, which it didn't, it lacked the precision machine tools. Where American factories used Swiss micro-lathes accurate to 1/10,000th of an inch, Germany's best tools, worn from 5 years of war, barely achieved 1,000th inch accuracy, and only on good days. The truth was devastating. German scientists had invented proximity fuse concepts before the Americans. But invention without mass production is a footnote. America didn't just understand the science, they industrialized it. From Europe to the Pacific, the VT fuse at war's end, while proximity fuses shattered German ground tactics, their original purpose anti-aircraft defense peaked in the Pacific. By 1945, the skies above the Pacific Islands became a proving ground for VT fuses. Facing relentless kamikaze attacks, U.S. naval vessels were shielded by proximity fuse shells that redefined defensive firepower. Before VT fuses, 25 Japanese planes shot down for every 100 attacks. With VT fuses, 91 per 100 were destroyed during the Okinawa campaign, Admiral Willis Lee declared, "Proximity fuses saved 100,000 American lives in the Pacific." Every Japanese plane shot down by VT fuses was one that didn't crash into our ships. The dual theater success against infantry in Europe and aircraft in the Pacific epitomized the American wartime philosophy. Mass produce excellence and deploy it everywhere. Firepower redefined analysts studying the weapon's effectiveness found the proximity fuse increased lethality 3 to 10-fold compared to conventional artillery. Against V-1 flying bombs, hit rates surged from 24% to 79%. In naval use, rounds per kill dropped from over $1,000 to $300. Lethal fragment area exploded from 60 to 3,000 square feet. This revolutionized artillery strategy. Concentrated barrages were no longer required. Shorter, more surgical fire missions became standard. Logistics improved, barrels lasted longer, and more units could be supported. General Patton observed that his forces could advance faster as VT fuses suppressed enemy positions more quickly and thoroughly. The result? A faster, more fluid Allied advance in 1945. Casualties, psychology, and the human toll. Contrary to some inflated post-war estimates, no credible records exist of 250,000 German deaths due solely to proximity fuses. However, the weapon's multiplier effect on artillery effectiveness is undisputed, and so is its psychological terror. Most German soldiers didn't understand what was killing them. Prisoner accounts mention air mines, tree bursts, and explosions that always seemed to come from above. The technology's predictable detonation height, around 30 feet, created an atmosphere of helplessness. One German officer admitted, "We tried everything: deeper holes, reinforced roofs, dispersion, nothing worked." Captured March 1945 reports finally acknowledged American proximity fuse represents 5 years advancement in electronics miniaturization. Replication would require total retooling of electronics industry, new materials, and a minimum 18 months development. Recommendation: impossible under current conditions. The final German military situation report, dated May 7, 1945, was unequivocal. American artillery employing proximity detonation has inflicted casualties exceeding all other weapon systems combined since December 1944. Recommend immediate cessation of hostilities to preserve remaining forces from annihilation by superior technology. Industry as a weapon. At the heart of the VT fuse story lies an industrial miracle. At Crossley Corporation, each production line could assemble 500 units per hour. Workers executed single operations with microscopic precision, thousands of times each shift. Factories never closed, not even on Christmas Day. While German soldiers froze and bled in foxholes, American assembly lines hummed around the clock. Copper from Montana, silver from U.S., Treasury vaults plastics from chemical companies that didn't exist before 1942. 95% of vacuum tubes from Sylvania, over 100 million produced, 2,000 suppliers, 110,000 workers, most of them women. By contrast, German shell production in 1945 relied on slave labor with only 60% quality acceptance. Sabotage further reduced effectiveness. By March, only 30% of German shells functioned correctly. American proximity fuses, meanwhile, operated at 94% reliability. More than a fuse, a mirror of two systems. The story of the proximity fuse is more than a tale of military technology. It is a portrait of two competing worlds. Germany, chasing wonder weapons like the V2, poured resources into a rocket that cost $2 billion, killed 9,000 people, and changed little on the battlefield. America, for half the cost, created a device that revolutionized both ground and anti-aircraft warfare, and then mass-produced it by the millions. It's the difference between obsession with brilliance and discipline in scale. A triumph of coordination. The proximity fuse validated the American organizational model, a wartime synthesis of academic insight from Johns Hopkins University, industrial powerhouses like RCA, Sylvania, and Crossley military foresight that turned prototype into production in under 3 years. In Germany, rivalries between services, fractured research, and an overstretched industrial base doomed similar efforts. Even after the war, American technical teams studying captured German research found what might have been ideas, charts, fragments of devices, but never a complete functioning system. The Germans had understood the race, but had no legs to run it. And so, the proximity fuse ended the war not only by what it destroyed, but by what it revealed, that in modern warfare, victory belongs not just to the boldest weapon, but to the system that can build it, perfect it, and deliver it by the millions. What if victory didn't depend on secret weapons or heroic last stands, but on the ability to manufacture genius at scale? By war's end in 1945, the story of the proximity fuse was no longer just one of invention. It was a mirror reflecting the industrial and moral landscape of the modern world. The Germans understood the theory, but not the execution. When Allied forces overran German research facilities in 1945, they discovered something both impressive and telling: a deep theoretical grasp of proximity fuse technology, but no ability to build it. The Rheinmetall prototypes, found among captured designs, were technically correct in principle, but they used conventional vacuum tubes, the kind that couldn't survive artillery launch forces. German engineers had experimented with hardening techniques, but they never achieved the rugged reliability of American designs. Even if they had, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. Why? Because Germany lacked the industrial ecosystem to mass produce such devices. No access to enough copper, silver, or miniature tubes, no nationwide precision assembly infrastructure, no machine tools capable of 10,000th inch accuracy, and no workforce trained for such assembly under wartime conditions. The industrial gap was too wide. The 30 feet between an American shell's detonation and the ground was more than a tactical height. It was the chasm between theoretical ambition and operational reality. Soviet reverse engineering 7 years behind. Even the Soviet Union, which received a limited number of proximity fuses via Lend-Lease, struggled. They received hardware, but no technical manuals. Soviet engineers spent 7 years reverse engineering the fuse, finally producing their own version in 1952. But even then, the quality lagged behind America's wartime standards. The lesson was clear: having examples wasn't enough. You needed the factories, the workforce, the tools, the tolerances, the training. You needed the culture of precision. The fuse as a lens on military innovation. The proximity fuse offers 4 enduring lessons about military technology. Evolution beats revolution. These weren't new weapons. They were better artillery shells. But that evolutionary step transformed battlefield effectiveness more than any stand-alone wonder weapon. Mass production equals power. Germany created jet fighters and ballistic missiles, but rarely in numbers that mattered. America treated sophisticated electronics as disposable ammunition. That difference was decisive. Integration is everything. The proximity fuse succeeded because scientists, engineers, manufacturers, and soldiers worked in coordinated alignment. American democracy enabled this integration. German inter-service rivalries and institutional silos did not. Secrecy has a price. Holding back the proximity fuse until December 1944 preserved surprise, but at the cost of months of avoidable Allied casualties. The dilemma between operational security and immediate impact remains a question for modern warfighters. The ethics of efficiency proximity fuses didn't just make war more effective, they made it more clinical, more inescapable, more final. German soldiers had no defense. A shell exploded above them with robotic consistency, raining steel fragments into foxholes, trenches, and command posts. This wasn't war in any romantic or chivalric sense. It was industrialized death, as methodical as it was unstoppable. But, and this is crucial, it was also liberating. Every German regiment pinned down or destroyed by VT artillery was one less defending the Reich, one less guarding a concentration camp, one less prolonging a war built on genocide. The very same technology that killed so efficiently also hastened victory and liberation. Admiral Louis Strauss, who ranked the proximity fuse among the core technologies that victory very largely depended upon, understood this moral tension. So did many American veterans, who were grateful the fuse had saved Allied lives, but haunted by what it had done to the enemy. After-action reports and personal testimonies described German positions where every soldier died at once, cut down by airburst patterns so tight they left no room for survival, no margin for error, no human agency in death. American superiority beyond the battlefield. By late 1944, Germany wasn't just fighting American troops. They were facing the full weight of an industrial democracy that could harness academic brilliance, channel it into factories operating 24/7, maintain nationwide supply chains under wartime strain, and field systems that married elegance in design with brutal functionality. Each Crossley production line, for example, assembled 500 fuses per hour. Microscope-trained workers performed ultra-precise tasks in seconds again and again for entire shifts. Not even Christmas Day saw a pause. Meanwhile, German shell production relied on forced labor, achieving just 60% quality control rates. By March 1945, only 30% of shells functioned correctly. American VT fuses, 94% reliability, despite their incredible complexity. The 30-foot difference, where ideology meets engineering. That 30 feet between airburst and impact was more than a ballistic specification. It symbolized the distance between American capability and Nazi assumptions. It marked the space where precision trumped terror, integration beat ideology, mass production outpaced miracle weapons, and most importantly, it revealed how a democratic society could outfight and outbuild a dictatorship, not by replicating its rigidity, but by marshaling freedom, innovation, and cooperation. The legacy, the first smart weapon. The proximity fuse didn't just end a war. It began a new era. It was the first munition to contain intelligence, albeit primitive, but its descendants' guided missiles, smart bombs, precision artillery would shape every war that followed, and it shaped peacetime. 2. Its clean room protocols, microscopic tolerances, and assembly methods seeded the post-war semiconductor industry. The women who built fuses in 1944 pioneered the techniques still used in electronics manufacturing. The organizational model unifying academia, industry, and military became the blueprint for Cold War innovation. Conclusion: the victory of systems, not just soldiers. When German infantry encountered proximity-fused artillery in the frozen forests of the Ardennes, they were up against more than shells. They were facing a system, a fusion of science, labor, industry, and military doctrine that had proven democracy's capacity to fight and win a modern war. The proximity fuse didn't simply make war more deadly, it made it decisively American, and in doing so, helped ensure that the future would belong not to tyranny, but to those who could combine freedom with discipline, vision with execution. At 30 feet altitude, the fuse detonated. And with it, the myth of totalitarian superiority was blown away. 30 feet, that's all it took. Just 10 yards of cold air between sky and soil to obliterate not only soldiers, but centuries of military tradition, ideology, and myth. The shell that proved everything. Nazi Germany misunderstood. Inside each proximity-fused shell, each capsule of miniaturized American genius was the embodiment of everything Nazi Germany failed to grasp about its greatest adversary. Where the Reich had dismissed American democracy as chaotic, it had missed the harmony within disorder. Where it saw diversity as weakness, it missed how diverse talent became the engine of innovation. Jewish scientists, exiled from their homelands by Nazi persecution, were among the minds who made proximity fuses a reality. American women, barred from combat, worked in sanitized rooms with microscopes, assembling death in the form of electromagnetic waves and polished steel. Germany relied on coerced labor to build crude munitions that often failed. America, allegedly inefficient and undisciplined, built 22 million sophisticated electronic devices and threw them into battle as disposable components of a larger machine. What the Nazis called disorder, the Allies called mobilization, when the past met its terminus at 30 feet. The German infantry who met this weapon on the snowy fields of the Ardennes were no amateurs. They were arguably the finest fighting force of their generation, battle-hardened, experienced, victorious across Europe. But they died not because they lacked skill, bravery, or training. They died because they encountered the future from the moment a shell left the barrel. Its radio-triggered fuse began measuring the distance to ground. At exactly 30 feet, it detonated, not based on guesswork, but on frequency shifts and wave reflections. Fragments tore downward into trenches, slicing through earth, wood, and flesh. In those milliseconds between detonation and death, the mythology of the Reich unraveled. What they had believed about American softness, about technological inferiority, about the triumph of will over machine, it all disintegrated in a cloud of supersonic steel. The death of myths, courage, fortifications, and the old way of war. The proximity fuse didn't just destroy bodies, it murdered ideas. The romance of the foxhole, that sacred cavity carved into the ground, once a soldier's safest refuge, shattered. The belief that courage could compensate for technological disadvantage annihilated. The notion that a warrior could stand against an industrialized enemy by sheer force of will burned away in an instant. It took only 30 vertical feet to collapse traditions that had stood for millennia. American victory, not in slogans, but in circuits. The proximity fuse was not a symbol. It was an argument made in circuitry and steel. Its logic was industrial. Its grammar was electronic. Its rhetoric was fragmentation, patterns, and statistical lethality. And what it argued was simple. Democracy, when focused, when mobilized, when driven to survive, can create weapons not of hatred, but of precision, not of cruelty, but of effectiveness, not of ideology, but of engineering. Every shell that detonated above a German trench was an American thesis delivered in fragments. It didn't scream slogans. It simply worked. Where fascism had prioritized spectacle, proximity fuses prioritized function. Sophisticated, disposable, and decisive. It was, in the end, the perfect weapon for a democratic arsenal. Sophisticated, yet so reliable that millions could be fired without hesitation. Expensive in theory, yet expendable in practice. Complex, but not fragile deadly. Without rage. This was not terror for terror's sake. It was mathematics applied to warfare, physics turned to doctrine, miniaturized science given a velocity of 3,000 feet per second. Where the V-2 rocket soared across continents to kill civilians in chaos, the VT shell hovered at 30 feet and chose its moment with surgical indifference. The final burial of the old world. In that final winter of 1944, a soldier's instincts betrayed him. He dove for cover as he'd been trained. He sought earth. He trusted depth. But the earth could no longer save him. What once sheltered now funneled steel. 30 feet above, the fuse counted down. And in those fractions of a second, the world that was died. The centuries-old contract between soldier and soil was broken, nullified by American radar and circuitry. Victory measured in megahertz. Germany measured its war in meters, the depth of trenches, the range of rifles, the distance to Moscow. But America, by 1944, had begun measuring in frequencies, in megahertz, in microseconds, in manufacturing tolerances finer than a human hair. The difference between past and future was no longer years, it was 30 feet. And in that vertical space, American democracy rendered its final verdict. That innovation matters more than ideology. That systems win wars, not just strategies. That liberty, when organized, becomes more lethal than fear. The proximity fuse did not just end battles, it ended an era. It didn't whisper of victory, it declared it in every detonation, in every fragment, in every foxhole filled by futures denied. The war was not won solely by soldiers, it was won by engineers, by machinists, by immigrants, by women. It was won not in the trenches, but 30 feet above them.